Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to all of you around the globe who are attending this morning's, this evening's, this afternoon's webinar. This is webinar number 10 in a series launched in April 2020 by the World Commission on Environmental Law, WCEL, of the International Union for Conservation of Nature. Welcome and aloha from my home in Hawaii on the other side of the globe from our distinguished speakers today from Africa. My name is Denise Antolini. I am a professor of law at the University of Hawaii, William S. Richardson School of Law, and I'm honored today to serve as the Deputy Chair of WCEL and host this webinar for us today. On behalf of the World Commission on Environmental Law, I want to express our gratitude to the speakers, the co-hosts, the organizers, and all the participants who have joined us today for this second webinar that will focus on Africa. Today's webinar is on environmental law in Africa. What is the role of civil society in environmental governance? I will introduce you to WCEL and then cover some logistics for about 5 minutes before turning the floor over to my colleague, the chair of the World Commission on Environmental Law, Justice Antonio Benjamin. He will introduce Robert Wabunaha, UN Environment Regional Coordinator, who will give opening remarks. And we are really honored that UNEP is a co-sponsor of today's webinar, along with the Global Judicial Institute on the Environment. Then you will hear from Ayman Shirkawi, our WCEL colleague and internationally recognized environmental law attorney from Morocco, who has been the lead organizer of today's webinar. He will serve as our moderator and introduce the rest of the panelists. The World Commission on Environmental Law is one of the 6 expert volunteer commissions of the International Union for Conservation of Nature. WCEL is a volunteer network of environmental law and policy experts from all regions of the world who volunteer their knowledge and services to IUCN activities and other partners. We have over 1,300 members, many of whom are attending today's webinar, which has over 120 participants registered from all regions of the world. You can go to our webpage for updates, news, resources, environmental law lectures, and also the past webinars. We are delighted, as I mentioned, to have as a co-sponsor today the Global Judicial Institute on the Environment, and Justice Benjamin will introduce that partner. As many of you know, WCEL had planned to host in March 2020 the Second World Environmental Law Congress, along with our partners UNEP, the Global Judicial Institute on the Environment, and many others. We had planned a full week of environmental law activities in Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. Unfortunately, due to the global COVID-19 pandemic, like many organizations around the world, we had to postpone our Congress. And as you know, also the IUCN World Conservation Congress planned for Marseille is also now postponed. So while we await those events, we have a lot to do. Oh, speaking of the Congress, I want to make sure to acknowledge today our distinguished colleague from the IUCN Council, Mamadou Diallo, who is joining us as a distinguished speaker. Mamadou, the other counselors, and the staff of IUCN are all looking forward to getting together when we can, in person, we hope, for the World Conservation Congress in the near future. But while we can't meet in person, there's a lot we can do to stay connected. So the WCEL launched this webinar series in order to keep that momentum going, to keep the dialogue going, to engage you, our members, partners, and colleagues around the globe in conversation about urgent environmental law matters. We wanted to share the amazing expertise among our members and partners and continue to press forward toward a just transformation of conservation law and policy around the world. So topics like today's webinar and the 2 other webinars that we're offering that focus on Africa help us keep hope alive for a rule of law and a better world. So now let me explain some of the functionality so that those of you who are participating can be fully engaged. If you can go to the bottom of your screen now, if everyone could, open up the chat box So the chat box on Zoom for this webinar allows us to communicate to participants. So it's a one-way communication to participants. We've already posted some messages and links there for you. For participants to communicate back to us, please use the question and answer box. Again, if you go to the bottom of your screen, open the Q&A box, and there you can put in questions for the speakers or any of us at any time, including if you have some technical issues, but we really look forward to your substantive questions. We will consolidate those questions, and our moderator, Ayman Shakar, will organize them and pose them to the speakers at the end of the webinar. We are recording today's webinar, and we will share the materials, the PowerPoints, and we will post that on the WCEL website approximately 1 week after today. And we encourage you to share this webinar with your colleagues. It is intended to be a public resource along with our other webinars, our lecture series, and other materials. Before I fade into the background, I want to acknowledge the assistance today of our staff behind the scenes. So Emily Gaskin, an environmental lawyer, is the Executive Director for the World Commission on Environmental Law. And we thank Emily for her tremendous assistance with today's session and all the preparation for the webinar series. We are also very pleased today to be joined once again by 4 professional interpreters who have an expertise in environmental law. Etienne Van Damme and Claude Areau will be interpreting in English and French. Simone Montgomery Chula and Teresa Sayeg will interpret in English and Portuguese. If you have not already turned on your interpretation, you can go to the bottom of your screen once again, select the globe icon, and select the language of your choice. When you change you can change your selection at any time, but if you're hearing both languages, there's a little option there to mute your original language, and that should clarify the language of your choice. And you can switch at any time. Lastly, I have to add that the views expressed today are the individual speakers' perspectives and not any official position of the IUCN, the World Commission on Environmental Law, UNEP, or the Global Judicial Institute on the Environment. The webinar is purely educational and we hope inspirational. So now I'm very pleased to introduce my dear friend and colleague, Justice Antonio Benjamin, the chair of the World Commission on Environmental Law for the past 8+ years. Justice Benjamin is on the High Court of Brazil, the STJ, and a world-recognized jurist and leader in the field of environmental law. He has a deep passion for Africa, which you will hear in just a minute, and was a great inspiration in helping us organize this webinar series to focus on Africa. So Justice Benjamin, I turn it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Denise Antolini. Let me begin thanking the organizers of this event, and beginning with Professor Denise Antolini. Her dedication is absolutely extraordinary. It's 3 a.m. in Honolulu, and even in beautiful Honolulu, I suppose it goes against human rights to be up at 3 a.m. to do this type of work, and do it pro bono, just for the public interest. And this is what defines Professor Denise Antolini: her dedication, her commitment to the protection of the environment globally, her knowledge, and her expertise in dealing with people, especially with complicated people like law professors and judges. So many thanks again and again to you, and of course to Emily Gaskin, who is behind the scenes, making sure that we have this type of very well organized event. Today's webinar is another one on Africa. And for many reasons, this brings me great happiness. First, because for decades, Africa was not part of the radar screen of the World Commission on Environmental Law as a priority. Things would happen when it would happen. There was not a proactive approach and dedication to this region that is crucial to biodiversity protection in the world and climate change and all areas of environmental law. Second, Africa is important because we see in the continent, from Northern Africa all the way to South Africa, Lesotho, Swaziland, the Portuguese-speaking Angola and Mozambique, the English-speaking, the French-speaking parts of the continent, we see major developments in environmental law and policy. And it's not just a copying and pasting as in the past in Latin America, Africa, and Asia of what has been done in other more developed parts of the world. It is creating through adaptation or often through complete innovation, new ways in designing environmental laws, in enforcing environmental laws, and doing it better. So this is the second point that makes me quite happy with this webinar. The third, and it's clear from the composition of the speakers, but also from the title, is that we are going a little bit outside of the orthodox environmental law box. And this is the result of us understanding that environmental law cannot be separated from policy, cannot be separated from the actors. But we had never done an expanded event like this. And I would like to thank my colleague Ayman Shekawi, who is with us, for instigating us, coming not just with the idea in the very diplomatic manner in which he expressed himself, but especially with how to do it, who are the people to be invited. So my gratitude to Ayman for leading us into this new avenue. We have a great group of speakers. I won't introduce them, but let me just say one word before I introduce Robert Wabonora about the Global Judicial Institute on Environment, which works very closely with UNEP. In fact, our secretariat is with UNEP in Nairobi, and we are delighted to be physically within UNEP. But we also work in cooperation, close cooperation with the World Commission on Environmental Law. The Global Judicial Institute on Environment, although an independent organization of judges, for judges, is an offspring of the World Commission on Environmental Law. And I would like to recognize this as a word of gratitude to the World Commission on Environmental Law. We have a whole set of events by judges, for judges, and many of the colleagues that work in this global family are from Africa. I made it sure that Africa would be strongly represented in this organization. And not just as members, but in the leadership of the organization. And that's something we are very proud of. Among the board members, we have Justice Emmanuel Ugirashibuja, the Chief Justice of the East African Court. We cooperate with judges from all over Africa, from Morocco to South Africa, and of course, Kenya. So I stop here, again, thanking WCL for having the Global Judicial Institute on the Environment together with WCL in this endeavor. Let me now introduce our colleague, Robert Wabunoha, someone that doesn't need any introduction, especially in Africa. And the same applies to my colleague, Mamadou Diallo, who will be introduced later on by my other colleagues from Senegal. Robert is the environmental law face of UNEP in Africa, but beyond Africa, because we admire his work, his dedication to the whole continent, and especially we admire his experience combining not just environmental law, but environmental policy. He has an LLM from Makerere University in Kampala, and he has been with UNEP for many, many years, and now he is the regional coordinator for environmental governance in the Africa Regional Office. Please notice, it's not environmental law only. It's much broader, so it fits completely within the umbrella of the scope of this webinar that we are organizing. And he has been working all over Africa with environmental law, environmental policy, development, human rights, designing environmental agreements, working on legislative drafting, and also in implementation. And finally, he has authored a number of publications in different aspects of sustainable development in English and in other language. So Robert, as a friend, I'm delighted to see you here, and many thanks for the years of cooperation that we have had together. And I would say that many years of cooperations that we are going to have in the future. Robert, please.
Thank you very much for those kind words, Justice Benjamin. We have been working together for a very long time, and I'm very sure we'll continue doing the same for more years to come. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for this opportunity to speak at this webinar on the role of civil society in environment governance. But let me first bring us back to the current times of COVID, these current times of COVID in which all of us are faced, and therefore I empathize with those affected and hope everybody is in good health and the families too. Here in Africa, this COVID pandemic has affected many things, including the environment. And as you know, Africa relies heavily on the environment for survival of the people. We already know that Africa's ability to manage and use the environment and natural resources in this, with the impact of COVID-19 is going to be heavily affected, further putting pressure on Africa's already strained resources, including those which we use for managing the environment. However, we are also seeing a bright future that the pandemic is going to help the continent reset its economic and socioeconomic pathways towards a more environmentally sustainable, low carbon and inclusive development. And this, of course, will mean that the use of environmental law and civil society's work is going to be very critical in the recovery efforts. We also see that civil society's participation is also going to be useful, especially in crafting and implementing the various decisions affecting the environment. Currently, at the continental level, Africa is developing a green stimulus program. And this is being developed through the African Ministerial Conference, which we're having next week. And among the issues being discussed are issues of governance, how governance is can be used to help Africa's green stimulus recovery program. The overall objective of this green stimulus program is to forge partnerships among all stakeholders to enable collaboration and also to strengthen existing mechanisms with member states, which includes also environmental law, especially on its implementation, on how we can use such implementation to help the continent recover. Ladies and gentlemen, in my work as a person who is, like what Benjamin says, who has a passion and experience in Africa, it is usually very important to contextualize any subject so that it fits into what is happening in Africa. Like what Justice Benjamin has just said, it's not about copying and pasting in Africa. It's about how do we put whichever subject we're dealing with, whether human rights, whether environment law, or whether climate change and so on, into the context of Africa. And therefore, it is instructive to know that Africa's natural capital steers economic development and is also a very necessary ingredient for the fighting of poverty, which is #1 challenge globally in a sustainable development. However, in Africa, we know that the challenge continues on balancing the interests of environment protection and social economic growth. And that, I think, will inform our discussions in this webinar is, do we take the route of only environment, or also do we take the route of socioeconomic development when we're dealing with environmental law? We know that balancing the socioeconomic and environment protection has both negative and positive effects of governance, and therefore, and also accessing the resources for people's livelihood. Even though African countries are facing a myriad of challenges in safeguarding their natural wealth, there are so many efforts which have been put in place to regulate environmental management by having laws, policies, and institutional frameworks. It is often said that Africa is not devoid of laws, policies, but what is missing is effective implementation. At the continental level, we can see these laws and policies converging at cooperative arrangements and at national levels in addressing the challenges of environment protection. However, the question which I want to pose is, how does African civil society influence these laws and policies? And if civil society does not influence these laws and policies, then the continent is likely to see a continued negative impacts on the environment. Environmental laws and policies and institutions in Africa at regional, national, and continental level show a trend over the decades. I will have a cutoff from 1960s and so, or earlier than that, where there's a tendency of moving away from extraction or exploitation for purposes of export to use and dispose of resources to more sustainable approaches. There are so many sustainable approaches which Africa is doing, which you cannot even discuss in this seminar and complete. We are also seeing the political and decision-making leadership in Africa increasingly being more interested and recognizing the need to protect the environment and natural resources in various ways, including the use of laws, of environmental laws. With a clear role defined for civil society, the next pertinent question which I have is, how do civil society organizations mobilize and strengthen in order to effectively carry out their role, which we know, of course. It is also important to add that over 70 to 80% of Africa is a youth population, and over 50% is composed of women. And therefore, we always never miss those two key actors in Africa who also, of course, form part of civil society, is how can we engage the women and youth to energize actions on environment and climate action, including those relating to the enablers like environment law. It is a critical question, but if you scan through the whole continent, you'll find everybody still grappling on how do we use the youth dividend and how do we use the women sector to take action. It is still a very big question which should inform our discussions today. We are also seeing that there are many nature-based solutions which have come into the development pathway in Africa. And my call is that civil society efforts should also be geared towards moving into innovative ways, including those in environmental law, to help in developing an application of nature-based solutions for development. What am I saying here? If you go back to what Justice Benjamin has said, no copying and pasting. The traditional copying and pasting was that human rights are key to development. But those human rights which were copied and pasted in Africa were not contextualizing the fact that you need to be innovative, adaptive, and fit within the socio-economic context of the continent. That in the 80s, 90s, when the human rights and environment movement became very strong in Africa, in my opinion, didn't have a firm foundation because it was not contextualized. The continent is still, the people on the continent are still looking at putting food on the table. I dare say that when you you tell them human rights, they will say, is it going to bring food on the table? Is it going to take my children to school? And so on and so on. And therefore, the advocacy for human rights need to be re-engineered and recontextualized innovatively so that it fits within the socioeconomic and the environmental context in Africa. That is my key message for this seminar. We'll continue engaging, and thank you for listening to me. Before I leave, let me take this opportunity to introduce our webinar moderator, Aman Chako. Aman Chako is the coordinator for the Muhammad, the 6th Prize for the Climate and Sustainable Development, as well as Strategic Development Officer at Muhammad, the 6th Foundation for Environmental Protection. Ayman is a member of the IUCN World Commission for Environmental Law, regional facilitator of UNEP accredited major groups and stakeholders in Africa, as well as the lead counsel for climate change at the Center for International Sustainable Development Law, Obama Foundation. Africa leader, Aman is also Africa leader alumni, champion for the Adaptation Without Borders Initiative and Atlantic Dialogues, emerging leadership alumni. He was formerly a member of the steering group of the Goalkeepers Youth Action Accelerator, as well as the executive director of UN Global Compact Morocco for UNDP, and special advisor to COP22 presidency and ministerial advisor for Morocco, following professional experiences in management and industry. Ayman has academic background in climate change, sustainable development, finance, law, and engineering. Ladies and gentlemen, let's welcome Ayman Chako to make his remarks. Thank you very much for listening to me.
Thank you very much for this very kind and exhaustive introduction for my background. Thank you as well, of course, to the Honorable Chair for his kind appreciation. And let me also seize this opportunity to share my heartfelt appreciation for his outreach and effective outreach when it comes to our continent and really making sure that African voices are heard, highlighted, responded to, and amplified when it comes to this important agenda going forward of environmental rule and governance, evidently. So I am Ayman. I will be the moderator of this webinar going forward. I'm particularly happy to be joined by an impressive array of speakers that will be contributing their perspectives, insights, expertise, and also asking some questions when it comes to finding, once again, and defining the road forward in these challenging times. This particular webinar is very timely, as was recalled earlier, just before I took the floor. In the next few days, we'll be starting the African Ministerial Conference on the Environment. Just this morning, as a regional facilitator of the African major group and stakeholders in the UNEP space, I facilitated a meeting that was a regional consultative meeting, and we looked together at all the items that will be discussed in this important meeting that will be chaired by South Africa. Among those issues, we'll have discussed and we will continue to discuss topics such as, of course, biodiversity, including the post-22 biodiversity framework, as well as COP15 that is to take place next year. We also, of course, look toward UNEA 5, the 5th session of the United Nations Environment Assembly. We learned that this session will take place in 2 different segments. The first of them taking place virtually to look at procedural matters in February 2021, and the second one taking place February 2022. We discussed other issues such as climate change, very relevant issues globally, of course, but also for a continent that is particularly exposed to the negative impacts of climate change and has contributed so little to the emergence of that issue, with, according to some studies, less than 4% of emissions when it comes to greenhouse gases. We were looking in that context, of course, towards COP26. We also discussed a very interesting initiative that is taken at the continental level. It is still being further refined, and it was also touched upon just moments ago. It's the African Green Stimulus Program, and how we can make sure that the post-COVID world, and even the COVID world that we're living under currently, really takes into account all the different dimensions of sustainable development going forward, including, of course, the environment. There are very difficult conversations taking place all over the world, including all across the continent. And it is important that environmental issues are provided with the adequate amount of space and consideration, and also that civil society as a whole in our continent is being included in a participatory manner when it comes to voicing their perspective and being part of the group and the solution that turns policies into concrete actions in a very timely and urgent manner, as urgent reaction is very much needed at this point in time. This year was deemed to be a super year for nature. As we all know, we ended up having to deal with a word that is quite different from the one we had anticipated we will be living through back in 2019. But the environment remains very much an important topic. Civil society in Africa remains very much on the front line of this conversation going forward, and particularly when it comes to law and governance as important instruments that ought to be leveraged when it comes to facilitating, empowering the type of timely, ambitious, impactful, inclusive actions we all need to see and would like to see. Earlier, we also referred to the important role of youth in our continent, evidently with women as well. And I believe that those would all be elements that will be addressed by our speakers going forward. So at this point in time, it is my pleasure and privilege to introduce the first of the speakers of this honorable panel. So Honorable Mamadou Diallo is from Senegal. He's a former parliamentarian and former mayor. He was elected IUCN Regional Councillor for Africa for a second and final term at the World Conservation Congress of Hawaii. He is a lawyer by training, specializing in international environmental law, education on environment, and promotion of ecotourism. Mr. Diallo has done many studies on biodiversity and management of protected areas in Senegal. He is Secretary General of the Senegalese Association of Friends of Nature, an NGO member of IUCN since 1996. He is a member of the Committee on Education and Communication, as well as a member of the World Commission on Environmental Law. He has chaired the National Committee on Senegal IUCN Sub-Regional Committee of IUCN members in West Africa, MCAD, and Regional Committee of IUCN members in Central and West Africa. Honorable Mamadou Diallo, as you can all see, his expertise is very deep, is very extensive and very exhaustive. It is also very well connected to many of the priorities of our continent, including several that, as I mentioned, we are discussing no later than this morning as a region. Honorable Mamadou Diallo, the floor is yours. Thank you very much.
Merci bien, Monsieur le Modérateur. Je voudrais vous remercier pour les paroles aimables que vous venez de prononcer à mon endroit. Je voudrais aussi exprimer ma reconnaissance aux organisateurs de ce webinaire. Remercier tout particulièrement mon collègue Dr Antonio Benjamin, président de la Commission mondiale du droit de l'environnement de l'UICN. Remercier aussi la vice-présidente Denise Antolini, ainsi que leurs collaborateurs, notamment Émilie. Je voudrais aussi associer à ces remerciements le PNUE, mais également l'Institut judiciaire mondial de l'environnement qui ont participé à l'organisation du webinaire. Saluer tous les panélistes ainsi que tous les participants à ce webinaire. Je voudrais aussi m'associer à Robert pour exprimer ma compréhension à tous ceux qui, à travers le monde, sont aujourd'hui affectés par le Covid-19. Nous espérons très bientôt dépasser cette crise avec les progrès de la science, puisqu'on nous apprend que certains laboratoires ont trouvé des vaccins qui peuvent être la solution pour freiner cette pandémie. Droit de l'environnement en Afrique, quel est le rôle de la société civile dans la gouvernance environnementale? Tel est le thème qui nous a été proposé. Comme vous le savez, les problèmes d'environnement sont toujours d'actualité et confirment la pertinence de notre thème. La gravité de la détérioration de notre environnement et les menaces qui pèsent sur le climat font partie des préoccupations majeures de notre société dans ses différentes composantes. Il apparaît néanmoins que dans tout cela, l'action de l'homme est au centre de la problématique. Les solutions apportées par les gouvernements sont encore insuffisantes. Parfois même, elles sont contraires aux déclarations d'intention ou aux exigences d'un développement durable. D'où la méfiance de certains et l'émergence d'une nouvelle catégorie d'acteurs appelée société civile, à côté d'acteurs classiques de la protection de la nature et de la gestion des ressources naturelles et de l'environnement. Donc, l'idée de s'entendre sur ce que c'est que la société civile. Parce qu'il y a beaucoup de gens qui se réclament de la société civile, mais c'est devenu aujourd'hui un fourre-tout où il y a lieu de séparer la bonne graine du vrai. Selon Adélie Pomade, dans la revue interdisciplinaire d'études juridiques de 2010, la société civile peut être définie de manière descriptive en révélant sa composition et ses caractéristiques. La société civile est ainsi constituée à la fois d'organisations non gouvernementales, d'associations de citoyens, d'éco-entreprises et de groupements de fait d'individus. Elle est caractérisée par son intention désintéressée, son autonomie à l'égard de l'État et sa capacité à la déterritorialisation de son action. En revanche, elle ne poursuit ni un objectif politique de prise de pouvoir, ni un objectif économique de recherche de profit. Dans une approche dynamique, la société civile est vue sous un angle actif, une entité juridique disposant d'un ensemble de droits fondamentaux revendiqués par ses éléments constitutifs, ayant un intérêt collectif de protection de l'environnement, poursuivi par l'ensemble de ces éléments constitutifs organisés en réseau pour une action collective. La société civile n'est pas la société tout entière, mais simplement l'un de ses segments. Son intérêt à agir réside dans son appartenance à la communauté au nom de laquelle agissent les décideurs. Ainsi, nous connaissons la société civile avec des organisations, des groupements, mais également des individualités que d'aucuns qualifient d'activistes, mais qui, au-delà de cette qualification, poursuivent toujours un objectif commun qui est la défense de notre environnement. La société civile contribue indirectement et directement à l'œuvre d'élaboration du droit de l'environnement et de son application effective. Indirectement, au regard des fonctions classiques de la société civile en droit de l'environnement. Dans le cadre de la mise en œuvre du droit de l'environnement, la société civile s'est arrogé le droit d'assurer un rôle de veille, d'alerte et d'action en justice. Un rôle de veille pour surveiller l'état de droit, l'ordre juridique établi, afin que nul ne vienne le perturber. Et s'il arrive que cet ordre préétabli est perturbé, ou lorsque la société civile sent des menaces de perturbation, la société civile alerte par des dénonciations. Pour mettre hors d'état de nuire les auteurs de ce qu'il est convenu d'appeler la criminalité environnementale, la société civile peut saisir la justice et parfois même demander la réparation ou la remise en état. Ce faisant, la société civile participe indirectement à l'œuvre de construction du droit de l'environnement par son influence et par la jurisprudence dans les décisions de justice. Cette action a été légitimée et inscrite dans les lois nationales et les conventions et accords internationaux à travers les principes de participation et d'information. Ainsi, les membres de la société civile ont droit à l'information fiable et claire qui leur permet d'accéder à toutes les sources d'information. Ils ont aussi droit à informer par la sensibilisation, la communication et la divulgation des informations collectées. Ils sont pour cela protégés en tant que lanceurs d'alerte. La démocratie participative leur permet de prendre des initiatives citoyennes, de procéder à des consultations citoyennes, d'élaborer des pétitions et de faire du lobbying et des marches de protestation, d'information, mais surtout des sessions de sensibilisation des populations et des différents acteurs. Un exemple au Sénégal, c'est la mise en place depuis 2017 d'un comité de veille et d'alerte de la Falémé. La Falémé est un affluent du fleuve Sénégal. Ce comité de veille et d'alerte est un comité mixte regroupant des Sénégalais, mais également des Maliens pour la protection de la Falémé, parce que tout simplement, la Falémé intéresse 4 pays, le Sénégal, le Mali, la Guinée-Conakry, mais également la Mauritanie. Et cet affluent du fleuve Sénégal est actuellement très dégradé du fait de l'orpaillage clandestin, avec utilisation de produits toxiques comme le mercure et le cyanure. Le comité a fait des tournées de sensibilisation, des marches de protestation, des rencontres avec les décideurs et les responsables de l'Organisation pour la mise en valeur du fleuve Sénégal, une organisation qui a en charge la gestion du fleuve. Le comité est à l'origine de réglementations d'interdiction de l'orpaillage dans la Falémé et de protection du littoral, mais aussi d'arrestation des contrevenants mis à la disposition de la justice. Ce sont ces actions citoyennes qui tendent également à déclencher l'action en justice par la dénonciation, mais également par l'inaction ou la violation des normes de gestion durable des ressources naturelles et de l'environnement, qui permettent également de suppléer et d'appuyer les autorités compétentes à déclencher l'action en justice et à participer au procès comme partie civile. La participation directe de la société civile à l'élaboration du droit de l'environnement, c'est également une autre facette de l'intervention de la société civile. Comme vous le savez, le droit international de l'environnement présente la particularité d'être élaboré avec l'intervention des États parties, qui disposent de la légalité et de la légitimité de légiférer, mais aussi avec l'implication d'autres participants, considérés comme partie prenante à l'édification de l'œuvre législative. Cela s'est particulièrement remarqué lors de la conférence des Nations Unies sur l'environnement et le développement à Rio de Janeiro en 1992. À cette occasion, la société civile a exprimé son intention d'intervenir dans le cadre de l'élaboration des conventions dites de Rio, à savoir la CBD, la Convention sur la biodiversité, la Convention cadre sur les changements climatiques et la Convention des Nations Unies de lutte contre la désertification. L'acceptation par les décideurs politiques d'une telle revendication a bouleversé tout le processus classique d'élaboration des normes juridiques, aussi bien au niveau international qu'au niveau local. La participation, la négociation, la consultation et l'implication ont bouleversé le système de gouvernance et ont donné naissance à la coproduction législative. Au Sénégal, la société civile environnementale participe effectivement à l'élaboration de la loi sur le littoral. Elle a également participé à l'élaboration du Code de l'environnement et du Code minier, pour ne citer que cela. C'est le cas de notre organisation, l'Association sénégalaise des envies de la nature, ainsi que le cas des membres de l'UICN au Sénégal, mais aussi les universitaires, la communauté scientifique, le secteur privé et les organisations de protection des droits de l'homme et des droits humains. Toutes ces organisations contribuent aujourd'hui à la coproduction législative, mais également participent à la veille de l'ordre préétabli, à la dénonciation, pour mettre également hors d'état de nuire les contrevenants aux droits de l'environnement, mais surtout rappeler également l'État et d'autres acteurs à respecter le droit de l'environnement, mais également les droits de l'homme et les droits humains. La société civile, ainsi entendue, est devenue source et créatrice de normes juridiques environnementales, aussi bien en droit interne qu'en droit international. Ces membres sont devenus des interlocuteurs crédibles dans les processus décisionnels. Ils assurent le contrôle social et juridictionnel en amont et en aval pour la légitimité du processus et la validité des normes édictées. Ainsi, la société civile a bousculé l'ordre préétabli depuis des siècles. L'État, avec ses prérogatives régaliennes, n'a plus le monopole de la création des normes. Le concept de gouvernance participative est ainsi érigé en mode de gouvernance moderne. Voilà, monsieur le modérateur, chers participants, la contribution modeste que je voulais faire dans le cadre de la gouvernance et du droit de l'environnement en Afrique. Quel est le rôle de la société civile dans la gouvernance environnementale qui nous rassemble aujourd'hui et qui nous préoccupe beaucoup. Merci pour votre aimable attention et je reste à votre aimable disposition pour les questions que vous voudrez bien me poser. Merci bien, monsieur le modérateur. Merci à tout le monde.
Merci, merci. Thank you very much, Honorable Diallo, for this very important remarks. I believe that we could not have asked for a better framing in terms of the conversations of the panel when it comes to this important linkage between the mobilization and action of civil society and the interface between that particular mobilization and action and the world of environmental law, specifically in our continent. As such, you've identified, when we look at the value chain of law, evidently you identified that when it comes to remediation, when it comes to the important role that civil society can play in seizing justice when needed, when requested, to remediate certain situations that are unfortunate. But you also looked at the kickstarting process in a way of that very thinking, and identified the role that civil society, specifically by providing concrete examples in Senegal, has been able to establish itself as a credible partner when it comes to co-constructing legal norms, and how participative government more than has evolved from a concept to a reality that one cannot very much escape when it comes to Senegal in particular, but more broadly. So thank you very much for those remarks that I'm certain all participants have appreciated particularly. I would now like to move to the next speaker of our panel, Mr. Kolisa Ngwadla, who I've had the privilege and pleasure of knowing for several years. Mr. Kolisa Ngwadla is currently responsible for business development and commercialization at the Council for Scientific and Industrial Research in South Africa. The research areas and technology portfolios span natural resources, including water and energy, built infrastructure, and ICT. He has also been a member of the South African delegation in UNFCCC negotiations and was the lead negotiator for the African group in the negotiation of the Paris Agreement. His area of interest in national and international climate change policy discourse, with a particular interest on the economic and developmental impact. He has experience in agricultural research, environmental consulting, corporate business development, and multilateral climate change negotiations. Kolisa is an agricultural scientist in the field of economics and plant breeding, with an MBA with environmental electives. As we are nearing an important anniversary of the Paris Agreement, I think the conversation around climate change becomes even more timely. Please go ahead, Kolisa.
Okay, thank you, Ayman, and good afternoon to participants in the webinar. And firstly, I just want to thank the Commission on Environmental Law for inviting me to share some views in this webinar. And I found the topic for discussion, particularly for an African webinar, to be quite interesting, you know, in the sense that it's about the role, trying to understand what the role civil society should play in Africa in respect of environmental governance. And there are three propositions that I would like to make. And then after that, I'll just provide some context behind those propositions. So the first proposition is that obviously in Africa, civil society contribution to environmental governance is indispensable. However, go on further to say that comes with a responsibility. And the first responsibility is being able to share the perspectives of the continent in international governance discussions on environmental law as well as environmental policy. And I was quite enthused to hear Robert earlier on indicating the fact that understanding the context is quite important. It is not about coming up with cut and paste laws. Laws need to be responsive to the socio-economic conditions of the continent. So there's that responsibility in the international arena that goes with the role that civil society can play. But there's a flip side to it. It's also about socializing international values and norms, because international policy discourse is about finding what is generally acceptable and supportive of a particular outcome that as a global community, we believe is best for our future and sustainable development in this instance. And so there is that responsibility and role now of communicating, sharing international best practice in order to support domestication of international law, as well as ensuring that there is appropriate legislation that respond to context. So that's the first proposition that I would like to make. The second one is that, again, I think Robert touched on it a little bit earlier on. When it comes to environmental governance, one always deals with paradoxes, all right? And in the case of Africa, it's about the understanding of a sweet spot of sustainable development in terms of competing socio-economic development objectives, as well as the protection and sustainable use of resources. And it's not binary from where I come from, because the very same socio-economic development is driven by the natural capital and the natural resource base. So it is to the interest of African countries to ensure that this productive stock, natural stock that our continent has, is protected to support socio-economic development. And this necessitates a new type of civil society, because in the past, one has observed single issue activism. And I think when it comes to addressing environmental governance, that condition is no longer sufficient. It's about being comprehensive in scope and ensuring that the trade-offs that governments need to make are understood. And there's a huge role that civil society can play in that regard. The third proposition that I would like to make is recognizing the changing society, the changing technology in terms of how we engage as people. And I would like to suggest that probably the modes of engagement by civil society in Africa needs to start being targeted at individuals, because as I will demonstrate a bit later, a lot of social movement is aligned with advancements in technologies, communication technologies. But at the same time, it's important to note that in Africa, there is a lot of marginalized communities who don't have to the advanced communication technology. So the mode of engagement needs to take those into account. So those are the three propositions that I would like to put forward. And to just provide a context of those, the first one is that in any participatory democracy, the role of civil society in policymaking through various modes. One is canvassing shared social values and norms, whereas on the other hand, it's also articulation of what emerges out of those engagements should actually drive the engagement of civil society in policy making. And I think, as I mentioned earlier, in terms of some of the responsibilities that go with this contribution that civil society can make, is that from an environmental governance perspective, and I'm particularly using my experience in climate change negotiations, it's quite important to ensure that the views of Africa are adequately canvassed in multilateral agreements and policies that are agreed to. And there's a responsibility of ensuring that there is interstate balance in obligations and targets in order to ensure that we can be to address global problems of poverty as well as inequality. Because if the international engagements are not sensitive to those contexts in African countries, we may come up with good international values and norms, which however, which, however, continues to underdevelop or expand inequality in terms of interstate relations.
Yeah, go in praises. Do he wonders, hallelujah.
Sorry, there's a
There seems to be a lovely song. It's trying to identify where it's coming from. Okay, it seems to be solved now. Thank you very much. Please go ahead. Apologies, guys.
All right then. No, and then the second part that I wanted to refer to in terms of policy making and articulation of shared values, there's also a civil society responsibility of pushing African governments further in terms of ambitions, targets, and understanding of trade-offs of international environmental agreements. So the role in terms of how, I think I made reference to the importance of targeting individuals through the proliferation of social media as a platform of understanding the temperature, values and norms, societal values and norms, will be that there's a big role that such technology can support the awareness building as well as mobilization of communities in order to arrive at those agreed values and norms. And secondly, the technical know-how is at times lacking in our African countries in order for governments to make effective decisions with regards to environmental legislation. And in most instances, government would err on caution rather than ambition, purely because there is not sufficient information to make such decisions. And the other contextual point that I would like to also touch on is on the characteristics of environmental governance, in that it's primarily characterized by balance and equity in how we address the tragedy of the commons. And I think I'd like to repeat this, is that there's balance and equity that is necessary, particularly when it comes to contribution of civil society in environmental governance in the continent. And the paradoxes or the conundrums that civil society have to deal with in terms of the characteristics of environmental government will be the fact that there's always a party, whether it's society within a country or in global discourse is a country, that derives benefits from exploitation of natural resources. And it's conceivable that one is not going to readily relinquish access to such resources. But the flip side of the difficulties that one faces in environmental governance is that the benefits of action in most instances do not proportionally accrue or directly accrue to the one who's taking the action, because we are dealing with a problem of the commons. And it's quite important to understand the second part as well, because it should inform the type of mechanisms and instruments that are made available to governments in respect of environmental governance. And my last point in providing a context for the three assertions that I've made is the paradox that I mentioned earlier in terms of the conservation of natural resources. Africa should be at the forefront at the conservation of natural capital by virtue of the limited historical exploitation of such resources. And as such, Africa can contribute a lot to the global effort. However, there's a balance that needs to be struck with how such natural capital is used to drive industrialization, increasing, as well as increasing the ability of African governments to address poverty and inequality. that will end my intervention there, Ayman. And thank you for the opportunity. I look forward to further engagement on the subject.
Thank you very much for your excellent remarks, much appreciated. Very structured indeed, and I believe you have added most valuable insights to our conversations. You also identified that it's the relationship between highlighting civil society's engagement and role while ensuring that there's some measure of alignment with the positioning of the continent as a whole when it comes to international environmental governance in terms of coherence. Of course, you also identified the role of technology as both an enabler and incapacitator, but at the same time a barrier that is very real in terms of some of the marginalized communities that we do have in our continent. You identified as well the very interlinked nature of our economic order and the global value chain and the positioning of our continent in that regard. You recalled the tragedy of the commons and how cooperation is so critical in terms of providing societal approaches to addressing the very deep issues while also capturing some of the opportunities that arise from addressing those issues. And finally, you did conclude, as you just noted, by recalling that paradox that you had introduced earlier between, on one hand, the very unique positioning of our continent when it comes to the conservation of natural resources, while on the other hand, this objective of industrialization and how important natural resources and their sustainable exploitation provide a space and lever to enhance the progression of our continent in the road of socio-economic development. And just as mentioned earlier this morning, those conversations and considerations were very much at the forefront of African civil society during the regional consultation meeting. So again, thank you very much, Brother Kolisa, for your excellent remarks. At this point in time, I would like to move on to the next speaker, an intervener. Mrs. Omoyemen Lucia Odigje Emmanuel is one of the founders, and she's currently the volunteer director at the Center for Human Rights and Climate Change Research. She also lectures at the Nigerian Law School and coordinates the Nigerian Law School Yenagoa Law Clinics, where she mentors law school students who are young law graduates from various universities in Nigeria on the practical aspects of law, ethics, and she guides them as they fulfill the justice mission of the various law clinics. She has contributed to several books and has been published by several journals. Her interests include human rights and the environmental rule of law, clinical legal education, land, property law, gender, climate law policy, and sustainable development. Omoyemen, the floor is yours.
Good day, everyone. My mandate is to talk to you about law as an important tool to promote integrated approaches for the environment. I will go on with my presentation. The science of jurisprudence has advanced the view that law and policies are a means of social control. In that light, it has been accepted by society that laws can be used to control evils, including environmental degradation, and to seek for protection, including environmental protection. And it is expected that where you have very strong laws, that the problem of environmental degradation and climate change will be dealt with. But unfortunately, it has not been so in reality. It is very, very clear that there are several laws on the environment, but it has not dealt effectively with environmental protection. So there is a rationale for an integrated approach to dealing with the environment, because the environment is connected, and the interconnectivity of environmental issues makes it necessary to be able to, integrate solutions and able to make them effective. For instance, climate change affects agriculture negatively and results in food insecurity. On the other hand, action to ensure food security increases agricultural productivity, which puts more stress on terrestrial ecosystem, including forest and biodiversity. On the other hand, also, you see that when though agriculture creates also a negative impact on climate change, on the other hand, also distorts agriculture. For instance, one of the recent reports of the IPCC states that one of the effects of having emission above 1.5 degrees Celsius threshold is that it will increase crop non-productivity. So you see that because of this connectivity between different kinds of environmental problem, trying to tackle them with separate laws and separate policies is not effective in practice. So the only way to effectively deal with environmental issues is to, next slide please, is to connect solutions and recognize that they are interrelated and to ensure that they are not dealt with in a silo. Can you slip to the next slide? So several environmental problems, as stated, are interconnected. Currently, we have laws that are separate dealing with them, treating the problems in a silo. So you see when one problem is solved, another kind of problem is created. So it is important to advocate for an integrated approach to dealing with environmental problem. And at first, the advocacy for an integrated approach started with advocacy to interconnect policies and solutions. But in reality, these policies on its own cannot deal with environmental problems. So we have to have effective laws, and having these laws separately deal with specific issues in a silo also leaves other myriad of environmental problems. So the only issue that can make environmental laws effective is to adopt an integrated approach. The elements of an integrated approach includes a strong understanding of the linkages among particular environmental laws, a strong understanding of the interdependencies among environmental solutions, a move beyond the silo to integrated laws that are crafted to respond to the interconnectivity, build synergy, and promote effective promotion of the environment. In reality, we have a lot of environmental laws, both at the international level and at regional and national level. Recently, or not too long ago, there was a research that was a study that was directed by the General Assembly Resolution 72/277 entitled Towards a Global Pact for the Environment, in which the General Assembly requested that the Secretary General submits at its 73rd section in 2008, a technical and evidence-based report that identifies and assesses possible gaps in international environmental law and environmental related instruments with a view to strengthening their implementation. And some of the issues identified were interconnected, but one key issue that I want to raise is the fact that environmental law, international environmental law, and not only international, because it happens also at the national level, is piecemeal and reactive. It is characterized by fragmentation and a general lack of coherence and synergy among a large body of sectorial regulatory frameworks. So a number of global instruments, some of which are legally binding, have been adopted by international organizations at the UN level, but they do not effectively deal with the environment. Those passed as laws also and enacted as acts at the national levels also leave a lot of issues with the environment. So it is important to begin to look for a way forward. And one of the space that is available for us as people discussing environmental law and the role of civil society is to use the space that's been created by ongoing discussions on Resolution 73/777, which replaced the Global Pact on the Environment, which was one of the IUCN was one of the strong advocates for this Global Pact on the Environment. Now, the focus has been on discussing this issue and trying to make, instead of a global pact, the current trend, the ongoing discussion, or the latest, is about coming out with elements of a political declaration that is supposed to do what a pact will do. But I do not think that that will deal with the issues with environmental law, especially at the international level. And whatever, trend happens at the international level ultimately affects the national level. So it's my thinking and my recommendation that it is necessary, as participants in this conference discuss the issue of international environmental law and the role of civil society, to strengthen advocacy and redirect the focus from just having a political declaration, but to having a binding document that is enforceable and that promotes an integrated approach. It is also necessary to review the initial draft of the Global Pact to see how it can be used to promote integrated laws for environmental protection, and to also advocate for an integrated approach to interpretation of the laws, because judicial activism can be called to play even before we have a binding pact. And this is all, is all dependent on having strong voices and strong people push for this. That is my presentation. Thank you.
Very much for your presentation, making the link between the national, regional, and global stages, including the important work that you identified linked to this towards a global pact for the environment, the relevant resolutions, the important study, the role that many stakeholders within the Commission have played in terms of facilitating progress in that regard, and the very important questions raised in terms of how do we address the gaps that were identified in a manner that speaks to the various national contexts across our continent. Thank you very much for these remarks and for bringing to the conversation the relevance of international considerations for the continent. So at this point in time, unfortunately, our last speaker, Mrs. Aminetou Bilal, is not able to join us. So we will move straight to the question and answers part of our webinar. And thank you very much to all of you. We've received a significant number of questions, and I will be therefore sharing them to our honorable panel. Some of them are a bit more general in nature, others were asked to specific speakers. And I'll kickstart us with some more general questions. So with two of them that I will field to the entirety of our panel. The first of them being linked to the legal protection of environmental defenders in Africa, whistleblowers. How do activists that work for the environment, what kind of protection can they have access to when it comes to blowing the whistle on some of the environmental crime that they are witnesses of in Africa? The second one I wanted to field to you is linked to the human element when it comes to environmental conservation and climate change specifically, and what kind of capacities are in existence in our continent and what kind of capacity building needs there are. And the very last question, I said two, but I lied, I actually had three. The very last question in terms of general questions I wanted to field to our honorable panel is how could international fora, such as the United Nations organized forums, be leveraged by civil society organizations in Africa to push forward environmental legislation at the national level, or or as well to push for enhanced implementation of existing environmental legislation at the national level. So thank you very much for your patience. I hope you will find those questions useful. And I will start in the same order of speaking that we followed earlier for the panel with Honorable Mamadou Diallo.
Je crois que la première question qui m'a été posée est relative aux lanceurs d'alerte. Je pense que c'est souvent la société civile avec les organisations de défense de l'environnement ou les activistes pris individuellement. Mais dans l'un comme dans l'autre cas, ces lanceurs d'alerte méritent d'être protégés parce qu'ils ont une action positive qui contribue à la protection de l'environnement, à la gestion responsable des ressources naturelles et de notre environnement. Et puisque c'est une œuvre de salut public, ils méritent une protection. À deux niveaux. D'abord, au niveau national, il faudrait que la législation prévoie la protection de ces lanceurs d'alerte. Et au niveau international, il faudrait également une convention de protection des lanceurs d'alerte puisse avoir lieu pour une protection effective, parce que ce n'est pas évident au niveau national, surtout quand il s'agit de dénoncer l'État et ses démembrements relativement à la violation de normes de protection de notre environnement. Je prends l'exemple du déclassement des forêts qui n'obéit pas parfois à la législation en vigueur. Je pense également à la gestion des ressources minérales et minières dont l'exploitation n'obéit pas parfois aux normes nationales comme internationales en vigueur et qui font l'objet de dénonciations des acteurs de la société civile. Donc, ils doivent être protégés. La seconde question qui m'a été posée, elle est relative à la façon d'implication de la société civile dans la création directe de normes. En général, c'est la coproduction législative. Il est admis aujourd'hui que la société civile est un acteur important. Et il faudrait qu'en amont, elle soit impliquée dans le processus de création des normes juridiques. C'est à ce niveau de l'implication en amont qu'on dit qu'elle participe directement à la coproduction législative. Sinon, indirectement, c'est surtout avec la jurisprudence ou bien au niveau local, appuyer les décideurs locaux dans la prise de décision. Voilà ce que je voulais apporter comme réponse aux interpellations qui m'ont été faites. Je vous remercie.
Thank you very much for having addressed the questions that were specifically addressed to you. I think you provided elements of thought leadership, of precision that will have been much appreciated by the participants to this webinar. Brother Kulisa, the floor is yours.
In the UNEP, we have a program on environment defenders globally. And I'm seeing also a chapter of it on the African continent. To give a background is that we are seeing a number of cases in which environment defenders are being attacked. By all manner of enemies or something like that when they're in the process of defending issues of the environment. I think it's only like 1 month ago, there was one who was killed in South Africa. And I think it was very regrettable trying to follow up on why did they kill him when he was trying to defend an innocent issue like environment. We have seen some in Kenya and other countries happening like that. The point which I want to bring in is the practical point is Africa ready for environment defenders as an instrument for environment governance? My experience shows that, to have issues environment defenders, sufficient amount of democratic space, which allows people to express their views and the rest and so on. Is Africa ready to have that large participatory democratic space? Is our governments willing to be challenged? Are they willing to be challenged on the decisions they're taking? If I take you back to the 2000 and the 1990s, when this movement on environment became very strong and up on scale and so on, when we had public interest litigation being very strong on Africa and so on, and bring you now to the 2020s, and you find the environment litigation, public interest litigation is going down. I tried to trace it, that's the area which I work in, and you find the number of cases on public interest litigation in Africa going down. And here we are introducing the system of environment defenders. Are we just cutting and pasting and bringing it into society? Is our people ready to embrace that system? I leave it at that because I may not have the right answers, but I could be having an opinion on that. In that, I think African society is not yet ready to embrace that very democratic system of environment governance. Going to the next point on the role of international civil society, in Africa to push for development and implementation in international fora of environment legislation. I also take us back and see how is our civil society organized or governed. When you go into the international fora on a global scale, you need to go there when you're organized. You need civil society, which is very organized. Many continental-wide civil society organizations, but are they coherent enough to manage international? You need to have a lot of research capacity to articulate issues. You need to be working in collaboration with governments, because the international plan is basically more or less a government-led process. And therefore, you have capacity to engage governments and provide them with the necessary cooperation and the rest and so on? Or are you going to be fighting them? My brother earlier on had said the new civil society in Africa we want is the one which is bringing value to the table, not so on. So is our civil society organized in such a way that they can bring value to it and the rest and so on? If you take, for example, the issue of implementation of legislation, which includes enforcement, compliance, and all that, it's a question of national sovereignty, because countries are free will to either implement or not international obligations. And if you bring in civil society participation in helping society to implement, do we see our civil society going, for example, to business and talking to business and say, can we help you to comply with environmental standards and the rest and so on? Do we have those civil societies? Or our civil society, which we have, is the one which is still very confrontational, even to business, to private sector? So the point here, which I'm trying to bring, is We need also a transformational change within a governance, transformational change within the civil society itself to see what positive roles can they bring on the table, what value can they bring on the table. It is good, of course, to oppose. I have no problem with opposition or opposing because you see alternative views. But I think the main issue, if I talk as an African, is more on the cooperation, other than bringing these Western civilization things of being antagonistic, so as to bring value to the table. Those are my 2 cents which I can take on those 2 topics. I'm sorry I couldn't pick the third one, but I think we can move on. Thank you very much, Moderator.
Thank you very much. Much appreciated for sharing your insights with us and indeed bringing to our African DNA of cooperation, collaboration as something we ought to be proud of in terms of a differentiating element in how we address those challenges. I think that would have echoed with African civil society representatives taking part in today's event. Brother Kolisa, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Ayman. I guess there will be a lot of overlaps between what has been mentioned by my fellow panelists with my intervention in this regard, because my experience both in domestic policy making as well as in the international policy discourse, particularly in climate change, I find that civil society that has been most effective in driving environmental interests in agreements, whether it's domestic law or an international agreement, are those, firstly, that are partners with government. The positioning is not about putting pressure on governments, it's on understanding the constraints that governments have, as well as working with government in coming up with solutions. The second type of civil society organization that, in my experience, have had a lot of impact are those that are quite comprehensive in their outlook. It's quite often that you would find single issue activism. It's like save the rhino, and that's it. If it means there are certain socio-economic costs or political costs that will accrue out of actions that are being provided, it doesn't matter, that's what we need. And you would be talking to multiple civil society organizations, all with different interests. So I agree with the point that Lucia raised earlier on in terms of integration and multifaceted consideration. That's the first contribution that I would like to make. In terms of environmental defenders and Africa, I think there's a chasm between the nature of international law and the issue of domestic law, all right? When it comes to international law, it's primarily framed in terms of what we all contribute, what effort we all make towards achieving an environmental objective. However, there's seldom instances where there are punitive measures. It's only a few MEAs that have punitive measures. Whereas if you look at domestic law, and the chasm that civil society can play in here is, how do you take these international values and norms, codify them in domestic law, and in domestic law, look at options of having hard law, all right, such that should there be environmental damage, there's a code that deals exactly with the criminality of such an event. I think the example that was mentioned around one in South Africa, the clear applicable code there is the Criminal Procedure Act. Someone killed someone, so that is sufficient to deal with it. Whereas if you are talking of instances where there is environmental pollution, there is poaching, even in that instance, we've got criminal procedures that deal with those environmental objectives that have been codified into criminal law. So it may not be fully accurate to say in the continent we've got an adequate policy and legal framework, because in some instances it's all aspirational. It doesn't go as far as criminalizing certain environmental damage acts. So that's my 2 cents worth in this regard. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Kolisa, for your remarks, as always, very much to the point and very connected to what we are trying to achieve through this webinar by building our capacities in terms of African civil society and providing more concrete examples as for what are the type of solutions that some of the jurisdictions have when it comes to access to justice, for example, for civil society organizations that are particularly active when it comes to the environment. Now I would like to move to Omoyeme and Lucia, if she'd like to answer some of the questions that were fielded earlier. Thank you.
The first question I would like to answer is the second part of the first question that says, can civil society support students in pursuing their goals in protecting environmental crimes? I believe that I will answer in the affirmative that yes, civil society can support students or students groups that want to pursue their goals in protecting environmental crimes. For instance, several universities have law clinics, and the law clinics, some of them have human rights clinics. For instance, in my institution, there is, we have several clinics, and one of them is a human rights clinic. And usually it is student driven. The students generate the issue, the environmental justice or social justice issue or gender justice issue they want to work on, and then they generate a project they want to work on within the period they are in school. And of course, they are allowed, as a body, the law clinic is allowed to collaborate with NGOs that are existing and have the same interests. So I think that such students, what they should do is speak to their institution to set up a law clinic. And the clinic movement is a very, very large movement. It's global. And then even the regional level, there is organizing, and at the national level. So I think it's something that is achievable. Then second, the question on legal protection of environmental defenders. One of the speakers has already pointed out that there is a UN policy on for the protection of environmental defenders, but he raised an issue that I do not agree with on whether Nigerians are ready for the democratic status needed by environmental defenders. I really think that whether they are recognized or not, they are individuals and or community of individuals that are protecting the environment. They speak up against environmental degradation, and sometimes their interest is at stake, even their lives could be at stake, and so they need protection. And the policy was shared by the UN Environment I think 2 years ago at the UNIA. And I believe one of the objectives of the policy was to end the violence against environmental defenders and assist states to deal with issues that arise as a result of that. And it was it was a policy that, if it's going to be implemented the way it was shared, recognized human rights and fundamental freedom, was aimed at protecting the rule of law in environmental matters. And UN Environment had the will, and they were clear on the fact that they will denounce if such a matter arises. There was a mechanism and system for it to be reported to the UN office at the state located in the state where it occurs, and it will be channeled to the headquarters and dealt with expedited there'll be expedited action, and the UN will stand up to denounce the attack, intimidation, and murder of environmental defenders. It's also, and it was supposed to have a rapid response mechanism, and there was also a plan to ensure accountability. So I also want to mention that there is the office of or position of independent experts at the global level also have crafted an independent expert that is responsible for issues of environmental defenders. So that means that the defense of environmental defenders is growing, is building up, and it has to, though it is still being driven from the international level, it's also been recognized in Africa, and African leaders, remember, commit to the resolutions that come and policies that come out from the UN environment, and they're expected to implement them in their states. And the next question is, how could international fora such as the UN organized forums be leveraged by civil society organizations to push forward their environmental legislation at the national level? I would say that one of the ways that is being done is through the activities of the major groups, because the major group system seems to be the space for civil society engagement in UN system, and within that forum, civil society and major groups and other stakeholders can come together to formulate, key points on key messages that they advocate with leaders and expect leaders to drive. And all you need to do is organize. They mobilize support of leaders from the states, and it takes like locating which of the states that may be interested in such issue and selling them the idea. Sometimes when you are able to win over the state, it is driven and put in their own agenda. So it is about organizing, and there is space for it. It's challenging for civil society organizations to push forward those issues, but normally it's best done by getting a state party to agree with the plan and to agree with the message and push it forward and canvass support for it. So how can we address the challenges? That's another question. How can we address the challenges related to access to justice in Africa? What should be done? I would say that the issue of access to justice in Africa is a very, very serious issue. And if you want to say access to justice, it's first of all being able to recognize the key elements for justice, and it's about not just effective remedy, but actual access, in the sense that there is a mechanism for to seek redress, and they are actually able to use those mechanisms and use it to seek remedy for themselves. And the major constraint about that is having people to have the confidence to do that. So that is what a lot of civil society organizations that are interested in working on such issues do. And I want to say critically that around the world, the clinic movement is also building up a strong momentum and driving the issue of access to justice, not only by research, but also by creating the space and the collaborations and and being able to support each other to push for it. I also want to say civil societies have also been very, very key in this. But I worked with civil society organizations years ago, Environmental Rights Action, and I was part of the litigation team, though I really was working with them on gender issues. And one of the I had the opportunity of working on two very, very important cases. One was brought under the Alien Tort Claim Act in the United States, and the other one was a gas flaring case, which is a very, very popular case that was instituted in Nigeria. And that was about not just individual lawyers as partners, but civil societies as organizations from the US, United States, from the UK, partnering to seek justice for people that have, that needed access to justice in the Niger Delta. I remember critically an organization like Earth's Rights was very, very, proactive in that case. And then the Climate Justice Network, I think from the UK, was also very, very proactive in that case. And I also want to state that it's something that can be replicated anywhere. The laws of many states, for instance, even in Nigeria, where access to justice issue used to be limited to only those matters under Chapter 4 of the Constitution, which are basically more or less civil and political rights, and could not be extended to economic and social rights and environmental rights because they were placed under derivatives as directive policies. The one major constraint that civil society had here was the issues of local standing, whether you could bring an action for a matter that you were not involved in. But I want to say over the years, there has been development, especially in human rights issues, like the enforcement of fundamental human rights rules makes it possible for that rule was made pursuant to the Constitution in 2009, makes it possible for any public spirited person to bring an action for human rights, to seek protection or access to justice for anybody whose rights has been infringed upon. So I really, really think that that is possible to do. And the other question. I hope
point,
that I wanted to. Okay.
Thank you very much for your passion. You've actually addressed many of the questions I was about to field in the second round by strengthening the understanding around the access to justice question and other elements that you've already provided. So you've addressed quite a few of the questions with a lot of generosity and passion, and thank you very much for that. At this point in time, I would like to invite our panelists, our honorable panelists, to ponder around, I would say, a couple of final questions and seize the opportunity to also provide us with what would be their key takeaways, final remarks that they would like to leave the participants with, or that they are taking away from the conversation that we've had today. So the two questions I wanted to indicate to you that had yet to be addressed and that had been repeatedly identified by some of our participants, one of them being linked to standing and specifically looking at environmental crime and some of the codes that are in existence, such as the African Court of People's Rights, such as the ICC, and whether or not there would be interest or added value in having something such as the International Court on Environmental Crime, for example, or looking again at the ICC in terms of how to work with what the mandate of the ICC is. And the other remark I wanted to share with you that have been shared by the participant is the feeling that some members of civil society in Africa have that with COVID and with the answer to COVID, some movement in terms of legal lawmaking by some jurisdiction can be perceived as being anti-democratic, as a measure, and has been portrayed as a way to fight against the virus. How do you think that could be addressed, particularly from the prism of environmental law? So having said that, I would like to invite Robert to react to anything that has been fielded, as well as provide his own concluding points. Thank you very much, Robert. The floor is yours. If you're still with us, Robert.
Moderator, yes, I'm still with you, but I lost internet for around a lot of minutes, and it went completely off.
Happy that you're back.
So somehow I lost the trend of discussions and so on.
Okay.
Yes, so I don't know whether it will be useful.
Oh, you're always very useful. But if you have any key takeaways that you would like to leave the audience with, that'd be quite appreciated. as we're concluding our webinar.
Yeah, okay. Okay, my key takeaway after listening to our sister from Nigeria is that there's a lot of strong will in civil society to cause change. And therefore, the issue is to continue encouraging and motivating civil society to do this change, which is needed for the continent to move forward in environmental governance. In that regard, I think my key takeaway is that the civil society should be put in a very good position in environment governance on this continent to supplement the efforts which are coming out from the state actors. I think that, to me, that would be the key takeaway I can take from this. Back to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you. Honorable Mamadou Diallo, the floor is yours.
Oui, merci bien. Et je voudrais revenir un peu sur le rôle de la société civile et dire que c'est un rôle extrêmement important. Le constat est qu'il y a un frémissement au niveau de l'Afrique sur les activités de la société civile. Eu égard à ce que nous constatons ça et là, il y a une volonté de la part des organisations de la société civile d'agir pour protéger notre environnement. Cela étant dit, il y a une faiblesse quand même organisationnelle qu'il ne faut pas négliger et un manque de moyens criards, un manque de capacitation, c'est-à-dire de formation sur le plan de la connaissance des textes en vigueur, aussi bien des textes au niveau national qu'au niveau international. Il y a également les moyens financiers pour prendre des avocats. Si je prends l'exemple du Sénégal, une organisation ne peut pas rester en justice en tant que personne morale sans prendre un avocat. Donc là également, c'est des moyens qui nécessitent une mobilisation à tous les instants. C'est la raison pour laquelle je pense que la Commission mondiale droits de l'environnement de l'UICN a un rôle que je voudrais qu'elle joue sur le plan international. C'est-à-dire essayer d'être un creuset où pourrait être créé un réseau des organisations de la société civile environnementale qui pourrait appuyer toute initiative qui se crée au niveau des pays et amplifier la dénonciation parce que, vous savez, nos pays, les gouvernants sont très attentifs quand la dénonciation est portée au niveau international. Mais si c'est au niveau national, eh bien, ils esquivent la question et on n'en parle plus. Donc, s'il y a un réseau international à l'image de Amnesty International ou que sais-je encore, et qui défendent, qui dénoncent, qui cherchent des moyens pour appuyer les initiatives locales, je pense que ça pourrait aider. Et à ce niveau, on me dirait peut-être qu'il manque de moyens, mais je pense que les organisations qui sont au niveau du secteur privé, dans le cadre de la responsabilité civile des entreprises, ils peuvent alimenter un fonds pour essayer en tout cas d'appuyer et de soutenir les organisations de la société civile. Sinon, si on laisse la société civile à elle-même, avec la toute-puissance des États, il va de soi que on ne parlera pas de changement notoire au niveau de l'Afrique. Ce sont d'autres organisations de la société civile au niveau mondial qui pourraient faire avancer les choses. Je pense à Greenpeace ou d'autres organisations qui viennent souvent en Afrique pour dénoncer. Mais au niveau local, il faut les capacités, il faut les organiser, il faut les appuyer. C'est ce à quoi vraiment j'appelle mon collègue le juge Antonio Benjamin et ses collaborateurs de la Commission mondiale droits de l'environnement, pour essayer en tout cas de soutenir la société civile environnementale africaine. Voilà ce que je voulais ajouter et remercier encore une fois les organisateurs de m'avoir permis de participer à ce webinaire. Je pense que c'est extrêmement important de multiplier ce genre de rencontres, de réflexions et voir la possibilité parfois peut-être de faire participer les décideurs à un très haut niveau pour qu'on puisse avoir également une volonté politique affichée de nos gouvernants. Merci, Monsieur le modérateur, et je remercie tout le monde.
Merci infiniment. Thank you very much, Honorable Mamadou Diallo, for those very pertinent remarks. Thank you for your call to action as well. Thank you for having highlighted the importance of means of implementation, particularly for African civil society. You also contributed the fact that African civil society needs to be supported, while there are other stakeholders at the international level, specifically when it comes to civil society, such as big international civil society organizations that do play a role as well, unless local, ground-based, underground-based, and national and really context-specific civil society that understand how those issues affect on a daily basis the communities that live there. Unless these type of organizations are properly supported, then their voices may be lost. Thank you very much for your contribution, Honorable Diallo. Kolisa, the floor is yours for any reaction you'd like to share with us at this point. Thank you.
Thank you, Ayman. I guess for me, the discussion has triggered some thoughts. You know, I think the questions that have been raised with regards to an international environmental crimes court got me thinking. You know, and we could be trying to solve today's and future problems using tools from the past. Okay. And I'm saying this because I think the concept of sovereignty, as much as it's still enshrined in international law, it does not have the weight that it used to carry. When we speak of a globally interconnected economic order, global value chains, provision of services to citizens by corporations and private sector, etc., the traditional tools that we used in an environment where the state was the be it and end all may not be having relevance going forward. So when we're looking at some of these challenges that we're trying to address from an environmental protection, it might well be that targeting the state in terms of laws is not the most efficient way. It's about how to influence, for starters, corporate culture in some instances, because corporate values and norms are what run the world. I mean, if you look at your Facebook, Mark Zuckerberg, in terms of the impact of Facebook, in the congressional hearing, basically the state is at the mercy of what values the corporate embodies, rather than an objective legal standard of how to address some of these things. And with these globally interlinked value chains as well, you find that it becomes difficult to enforce some environmental law provisions. It reminds me of the old debate in the climate change policy discourse on how do you account for emissions? Is it from the source where you burn fossil fuels, or is it consumption-based emissions that can lead to change? You know, in terms of you've got China emissions growing, but it's driven by consumption in other countries. And China is merely part of a value chain that's providing a service. So in an environment that is evolving, that is interlinked in that session, I think we need to start thinking about some creative solutions. Just because we have nails, which is the law, does not mean that every problem requires a nail and a hammer. So that's all. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very much, Kolisa. And indeed, sometimes to a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And as such, it's important to keep an open mind and to be innovative, creative, strategic as for where to put pressure when pressure is needed, so that we can get the kind of results that we would like to see to the benefit of the environment and sustainable development in general. And thank you as well for highlighting the role of the private sector in terms of value setting, and that role has been gaining in volume and depth in the last few years. Omo Yemen, the floor is yours. We cannot hear you. You're muted. Yes.
Actually,
please go ahead. Thank you.
Okay. I just wanted to contribute to the question on biodiversity offsets by recommending a publication to the person to read through. Is a publication done by OECD. Is titled Biodiversity Offsets, Effective Design and Implementation, Policy Highlights, and deals with that question. Just that the examples in the publication are not really from the African region. Perhaps that could help the person who asked that question. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for sharing with us the existence of that very relevant publication. And biodiversity, as was actually part of what was outlined by Kolisa earlier, epitomizes the linkage between seeing environmental conversation as both this tremendous opportunity for our continent, while also having this role of stewardship that we have, and at the same time the imperative of sustainable development and answering to the social and economic needs of our societies in our continent. Thank you very much, all of you, for your remarks. I think we had a very rich panel, very impressive panel. We also benefited from some very insightful questions. On behalf of the organizers of this webinar, it falls to me to express our most heartfelt and appreciative thanks for these excellent remarks, for having made yourself available with such generosity, with such expertise on what is now a Thursday afternoon, evening for some of us. Although I feel bad mentioning that, given how early it was for Denise and Emily, who are joining us from the other side of the world, quite literally. So thank you again, everyone, for having been part of this event. We look forward to your engagement in upcoming webinars that will be organized by the World Commission of Environmental Law of the IUCN. This webinar has been recorded, and the recording will be eventually made available publicly. So we invite you to once again consult that recording later on. Thank you, everyone, for this amazing opportunity. It was my pleasure and privilege to moderate this session. Thank you.